Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at round number 6 of the Qatar Masters Open being held here in Doha. Now, Magnus Carlsen on a bit of a surge. He's won a couple of games. Would he be able to keep it up once again, playing with the black pieces against his 5th Indian out of 6 players? Let's see. So, we get e4 from Samant, and Magnus decides to play e5, being very, very solid here. We get knight to f3, knight to c6, and now the move bishop b5, and Magnus plays a6. Now, a couple of days ago against Pranesh, Magnus tried to play very offbeat. He played the modern system, but he really just decides that today it's not there. Try and play fundamentally sound openings and beat his opponent with understanding. So, after a6, we now get the move bishop to a4. Magnus plays knight to f6, and we get this move castle, and Magnus plays the move b5. We get bishop b3, and now bishop e7. Now, again, all very standard so far from Magnus. Perhaps it's a little bit unusual to play b5. Normally, black plays bishop e7 first, and then after rook e1, plays b5. But nonetheless, everything should transpose. So, we get bishop e7, rook to e1, and now Magnus plays d6. We get c3, castles, and now the move h3 is played here. Now, if we do a little bit of fun trivia, way back in the Stone Age, I think it was 2005 if I'm not mistaken, in my first ever meeting with Magnus Carlsen, we had this exact position, and in that game in Biel, I believe that I played the move d4 against Magnus, not the move h3. Now, there's some drawbacks if you do play d4, because while you build the big white center very quickly, black can now go bishop g4, putting a lot of pressure on this diagonal towards the knight on f3 and the queen on d1, but also this pawn on d4 as well. So, we get the move h3 being played here, and after h3, we have the move knight to b8 being played by Magnus, d4, and knight bd7. Now, this is the classic Breyer system. Magnus actually played this a lot in his younger years. In fact, I remember preparing for this variation many, many times. But in recent years, Magnus has actually played the much more solid, or I should say, drawish approach with castle, c3, and d5, which is a marshal. But in this game, Magnus is playing at 2500 once again. He does not want to draw. So, back to the game, we get this move d4, knight d7, knight d2, bishop b7, and bishop c2. And Magnus plays rook e8, knight to f1, bishop f8, knight to g3, and now the move g6. Now, it's a very fluid situation here. White has this big white center here with the pawns on d4 and e4 in this position. However, black can very quickly play for moves like c5 or even d5, blowing up the center very, very quickly. And additionally, black also goes for the double fianchetto with the two bishops on g7 and b7. But last but not least, or I should say most importantly, all of the pieces are staying on the board here. And when you're playing a lower rated player, you want to keep all the pieces on the board so there are more options, more chances for them to make a mistake. So, after g6, we get this move a4, and Magnus plays the move knight b6. Now, knight b6 is considered to be a little bit dubious here, but it's not like it's a move that loses or anything. And if it doesn't lose, why not do that? Because obviously, at the end of the day, our opponents, I speak more as the top player here, when we're playing the lower rated players, one thing that they do have, the great equalizer, is opening preparation. So, if they can blitz out 20 moves and play like a 3,500 rate stockfish, we lose one of the key advantages that we do have when we're playing competitively, because at the end of the day, no human can compete with stockfish. So you don't really want your opponents being able to blitz out 20 moves. You want them to have to use their human brain and have to come up with the best moves over the board, because otherwise you're playing stockfish, and that's no fun. If you play stockfish, what's the point? Nobody wants to play stockfish. So, in this position, after knight b6, we get the move b3 played here. Magnus trades on a4, and now he plays the move a5, which is an excellent move here, as we'll see in the long run, because what Magnus does here is he fixes his pawn on a light square where the pawn can be targeted by both the knight and the bishop. Additionally, if black were to play, say, bishop g7, after a5, knight d7, white can play bishop d3 here, always putting pressure on his pawn on a6, or even play this move bishop a4, pinning the knight on this d7 square and the rook on e8 as well. So a5, great move. It takes away white's ideas of playing a5, fixes the white pawn on a light square, and black is always going after. So we get rook b1 here, played by Samant. We get bishop g7, and now we have d takes e5, d takes e5, and this move queen takes d8. Now, what this reminds me of is many, many years ago, there was this American international master who goes by the name of John Donaldson. He's been the captain of the U.S. Olympiad team quite a few times. And I remember, I think it was all the way back in Reno at the Western States Open, and something like, I want to say 2006, 2004, all those years blend together, obviously. That's nearly 20 years ago. But I remember that John Donaldson was playing against this up-and-coming kid. There was this Asian kid. He's like 11, 12 years old. Very, very strong, like 2,200-ish. And Donaldson just happily traded off the queens, went into an endgame, and won. Now, one of the prevailing theories is that when you're playing players who are lower rated, that generally they're going to be very, very sharp tactically. And so if you can get a positional endgame, you'll probably have more chances to outplay them. Now, of course, Magnus has built his reputation on endgame, so that helps as well. But here his opponent is too happy to trade the queens in this even material game and think that he can draw easily. But he's playing Magnus Carlsen, the greatest endgame player of all time, and there is no simple way to force a draw in this position. So here, white should have played bishop e3 first, and the reason is somewhat nuanced here. If Magnus were to trade the queens now, the knight on b6 is under a lot of pressure here, and black cannot play his move knight to d7 because then white sacks the rook for the knight, and after knight takes rook, rook takes bishop, white has a bishop and a knight in return for the rook, and he is completely winning. So in the game, when we get queen takes d8 first, now after rook a d8 here, if white goes bishop to e3 in this position, black can play knight f d7, guarding the knight on b6, and you have no sacrifice here on the d file anymore. So we get rook to b5, Magnus plays knight f d7, guarding the pawn on e5 here, and we get rook takes a5, and now Magnus plays rook to a8. Now, it's very clear that Samant in this position thought, okay, I'm up a pawn temporarily, but even if black wins the pawn back, black can't be that much better. But in fact, black is much better, and the main reason that black is much better is the pawn on e4 is under some pressure here potentially, but a4, of course, is going to be captured, and c3, most importantly, is a very, very weak pawn. So these three pawns on e4, c3, and a4 are actually very weak here, and white doesn't have any way to put pressure on e5. You'll notice the bishop on b7, always find the pawn on e4, but you have no way to generate any pressure on the pawn on e5 or c7 with these bishops on c2 and c1. So we get the move bishop to e3 being played here by Samant, and now Magnus decides to play the move knight takes a4. Now after knight takes a4, we get the move rook to b1, and Magnus plays bishop c6. And again, Magnus is starting to take over the game here because the pawn on c3 is very weak, e4 always being spied on, and black has no weaknesses. The pawn on c7 can never be attacked here. So all of black's pieces are very, very well placed here, and black has great chances to win the game. So Samant goes rook to b4, which is a mistake. But again, very hard to play this position because on top of being a little bit worse here, white also has no time. Magnus has been playing this game very, very quickly, trying to put pressure on the clock as well as the board. So Samant plays rook b4 after a nearly 7-minute think, but now Magnus plays bishop f8, another very good move, and we get a big blunder with rook to c4. Now, bishop takes a4 is maybe still playable here because if black takes the rook, you can take the bishop here. And again, we end up in a situation here where white has a bishop and a knight in return for the rook. But after bishop takes a4, black can take with the bishop. You go rook b7, bishop to d6 here. And black has the two b's, and very specifically, this bishop is going back to c6. And in the long term with the two b's, black will have great winning chance. Now, do I think that Magnus would win this endgame against Stockfish? Absolutely not. Stockfish would draw very easily with the white pieces, but in human play, it's very, very hard to play, mainly because in the long term, the bishops are always going after bishops on d6 guards e5, e4 is weak, there's rook a3 here, black can eventually maneuver the knight around to either c4 or a4, and it's just highly unpleasant. Meanwhile, the knights here have no squares. f5 is covered, d4 is covered, so these knights are not all that great for white. So Samant plays rook c4, which I understand because at this point, he's very low on time, but he's trying to simplify the game. He's trying to find easy moves, simplify it as much as he can, and hopefully get the draw. So Magnus plays knight a c5. We get bishop takes knight. We get bishop takes bishop. And now knight takes e5, temporarily sacking the horse. Magnus plays bishop takes f2, a very, very good move here because if you were to take the knight on e5, after rook takes c5, white has one extra pawn, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, and white is winning the game. So Magnus sacks the bishop temporarily. We get king f2, knight takes e5, rook to c5 here, putting pressure on both the knight on e5 as well as the bishop on c6. We get f6 played here by Magnus. Now, rook to a2 is also a move that could have been played here, but I really like Magnus's decision because here after rook a2, rook takes e5, rook c2, and knight e2, there's bishop to b7, and while black still has an advantage here after king to e3, it's not so easy to prove, and a lot of pawns are coming off the board. After, say, bishop a6, c4 takes, you get knight f4 here. White has 3 pawns on the board, black has 4 pawns, but with the limited material, the chances for white to defend this are much better. So Magnus plays f6 instead, and now we get bishop to b3, king to f8, king to e3, another good move. We get rook to a7, knight to e2, king to e7, knight to d4, and now we get king to d6. Samant sacks the rook for the bishop. All these are best moves, by the way. We get takes, knight b5, king e5, and now we have this move, bishop to d5, which is a horrible, horrible blunder, and frankly, just unbelievable. In this position, white had to take the rook on a7, and after knight takes a7 here, black has an advantage in this endgame here with the bishop versus the knight. The main reason is that, say, bishop c4, knight c8, bishop b5, knight to d6 here. After bishop c6 and, say, h5, black is always pressuring the pawn on e4, and eventually he will put all of his pawns on the opposing color. So say you go like g3, g5, let's say you get this position, for example, not g4, sorry, takes and king e3. You'll notice the pawns are on the dark squares here, but white is actually relatively okay in this endgame. Anyway, also worth pointing out here is that after g3, if black plays g5, white can actually go h4, fixing this pawn on h5, which is the same color as the light square bishop. So in this position, white should never lose this game. But instead, Samant plays bishop d5, which is simply unconscionable, and I really just don't know how to even explain this move. To me, I guess it's just a matter of getting low on time and panicking, but to not take the rook here is just something that nobody above 1800 should ever miss. Period. But Samant probably gets low on time, he's nervous, he thinks he's just he'd rather not play this worse endgame, and so he decides to play it. But after rook to a6, knight takes c7, black can now go rook to a5. Not the only move that works, but he plays rook to a5 here, and suddenly white has nothing. What Samant probably saw was rook a7, knight b5, hitting the rook a6, knight c7, and making a draw. Or even rook to a3, threatening rook c3, but then knight b5 back, guarding the pawn, hitting the rook and taking the knight on c6. But unfortunately for Samant, Magnus here in this position can simply play rook to a5, and now it's just hopeless. Because if Samant takes the knight on c6 after rook c5 here, you will lose either the bishop on c6 or the knight on c7 and the pawn on c3. Either way, regardless, even if you get this position, even this position is just completely lost with the rook being better than the bishop. So we get knight e6. Magnus plays knight to e7. We get bishop c4, rook a4, and after bishop b3, rook takes e4, king d3, and knight to d5. Samant resigns the position, and Magnus Carlsen wins a third game in a row. Now, the reason Samant resigned is quite simple here. White is going to end up in an endgame like this, where the rook is simply much better than the knight, and with the same number of pawns on the board, it's just completely hopeless. So, a fairly shocking blunder by Samant here to not take the obvious rook on a7. Would he have drawn this game? I think it's fairly difficult to predict whether he would have. I still think Magnus would have had great winning chances, but I don't think it's implausible that he would have drawn if he had actually taken the rook. Alas, he blunders horribly with bishop d5 and loses. So Magnus moves now to 4.5 points out of 6, still half a point or 1 point out of the lead, but he is climbing back towards the top of the leaderboard. All right. So in the next game, we of course have my game where I am playing with the white pieces against David Provian from Russia. Now, David Provian needs no introduction. I have played against him many times in various Titled Tuesdays, the Speed Chess Championship. Someone that I'm really familiar with, someone who's a very dangerous blitz player, and because of that, having this awareness of how strong he is, I'm obviously not taking him lightly. And to even add more to it, Provian's rating somehow is down at a very low 25.99 right now. His peak was about 26.60. He won the Gibraltar Open a few years back, so a very dangerous player. All right, so today I decided to play d4. Provian plays d5. I go c4, e6, knight f3, knight to f6, and now I play the move knight c3, and Provian plays c5. Now, this, of course, is what is known as the semi-trash variation, or I guess semi-trash in the Queen's Gambit, maybe, or maybe we just call it the semi-trash altogether. But we get c5. So here I take on d5. He takes with the knight. Now, generally, just to explain the opening very specifically, here black can play c5, and this is what is known as the trash variation, where black plays d5, c5, and e6. However, when black plays knight f6, knight c3, and c5, this is, of course, the semi-trash, I think just because the knight has been brought out. So it's not the full-on with e6, d5, c5, but because you played knight f6, it's the semi instead. So, after c5, I take on d5. Provian captures the knight. I go e4. We got the swap, cd4, cd4, bishop b4, bishop d2, takes, and now castles. Now, This is a system that became very popular thanks to the former world chess champion Vladimir Kramnik, who started playing it a lot in the late 2000s and into the 2000 teens. The main reason it's so annoying to face with white pieces is because we're already in a situation where white has a big white center with the pawns on e4 and d4, but already there's some material that's come off the board. Both sides have traded off a knight and a bishop here, so there's already somewhat limited material, but in return for exchanging pieces off, you have a big white center. So here I play bishop c4. Pravian plays knight d7, castles b6. I go rook a d1, bishop b7, and rook f e1. Now, the placement of the rooks is very simple. I want to play d5 or e5 at some point, and I'm not really worried about the c file because all my play will come on the d and the e files, so the rooks belong on these two squares. So Pravian goes knight f6, and now I play this move bishop d3. Now, bishop d3 is not a mistake, but it is not the best move. Now, the reason that I decided to sort of audible at the chessboard, to use a football term, and play bishop d3 here is because Pravian was moving instantly at this point. Now, similar to the Magnus game, I'm playing someone lower rated than me, and I don't want to end up in a situation where I'm playing all these moves and they're literally moving instantly because they've prepared at home with Stockfish. So I want the human element of the game to come into play. And Pravian doesn't actually play the system all that frequently. So for that reason, I figured let's just play chess. So I go bishop d3. Now Pravian plays rook c8 after a bit of a think. I go queen to f4. He plays queen c7. And now I go queen h4, trying to win the game immediately. If black were to play a move like, let's say, a6, this is actually completely winning after e5. Because in this position, I'm attacking the knight on f6 with the pawn, but also the knight guards against the mate threat. So if black moves the knight away from being captured, after queen takes h7, it's simply checkmate. GG, why not? So Pravian plays h6 here to dodge any mate threats on h7. And now I play h3, simply creating the classic Lufthansa for the king on h2 to avoid the ice skaters on the back rank. We get to move rook fd8, and now I play this move rook e3. And here Pravian uses 30 minutes before playing this move a5. Now, I was very happy when Pravian used a lot of time because I knew this position objectively is fairly balanced. But again, it's not so easy to play for someone who doesn't normally play these sorts of positions because white has more space due to the central pawns. And so Pravian, a little bit uncomfortable, plays this awkward move a5. Now, it's not a bad move by any stretch, but after rook to b1, suddenly there's this big weakness on b6, and it's very hard to defend. When you combine that with the fact that I now have a massive time advantage of 30 minutes, things are starting to look up. So Pravian plays a4 here, and now I play a3. Now, one thing that I was very critical about after the game is my time usage. I was not very happy. a3 is a move that I think I could have played probably in 5 or 10 minutes, but instead I used 17 minutes before playing it. Now, the reason I think that I should have played this move right away is because it's a simple move for a few reasons. Similar to the Magnus game, I'm fixing this pawn on the same color as my bishop, while my pawn can never be attacked by his bishop. Additionally, I now create a potential outpost on the b4 square for my rook where I can target a4 and guard the pawn on d4 as well. So I spent a lot of time on this move, not very happy about it, but it is what it is. So we get king to f8, which is a strange move from Pravian. I'm guessing that he figured that if he goes to h8, the king is fine here as well, but he essentially wanted to dodge. Let me just set up a random position. He wanted to dodge some position where there would be a fossil with bishop to h7, winning the queen on c3, or even a rook on c3. So he wanted to dodge any fossils with like queen c3, but he also figured with the king on h8 is further away from the center of the board. And so when he goes to f8, he figures in an endgame, the king will come to the center very, very quickly. And it's not really easy for me to attack this king, even though it looks kind of awkward on f8. So I play bishop b5 here, trying to target the pawn on a4, and of course the pawn on e4 is guarded by the rook and the queen, and now Pravian plays queen c2, and I play this move rook be1. Now again, all these moves, these last 2-3 moves, I probably should have played quicker, and after I play rook b to e1, Pravian sacks the bishop on e4, and I get a little bit tilted. Now the reason I got tilted is because I actually did not realize how dangerous this move potentially could be, and so I spend 7 minutes before capturing. Now again, this is a move that I should play in 30 seconds. I should not use any time at all, because if I don't capture the bishop, I'm simply down one pawn here, and what am I even doing? So I spend 7 minutes to take the bishop. He takes back. I take with the rook here. I do not take with the queen because this endgame is actually very, very dangerous suddenly after rook to d5 here. If I go bishop f1 and black gets rook c3, suddenly black is pushing p on the queen side, and it's not really clear whether I can even get the bishop and the knight over in time to save the game. So I definitely want to take with the rook here and keep the queens on the board. We get queen b1, checking my king and hitting the bishop on b5. So now, of course, I play bishop f1. and we get the move rook to d5 from Pravian. He would love to go rook to c1, pinning the bishop on f1, but then I have queen takes rook, which is checkmate. So he goes rook to d5, and now I play the move queen to f4, and Pravian plays king to g8 fairly quickly. Now, in this position, I spend nearly 9 minutes to play this move rook to e1. Now, this is where the game really started to unravel for me, because at this point, I was very quickly going to play this move knight to e5. In fact, I think I almost reached for the knight to play this move before actually spending time. Now, if I had played knight to e5 here, this is a huge blunder. Initially, I thought black goes rook to f8, for example, and the show goes on, or even if black sacks the rook for the knight after takes, rook c1, takes, rook f1, king h2, I can never really lose this position. But then I realized if I play this move knight to e5, black is f5, getting rid of the threats towards the pawn on f7, attacking the rook on e4 as well. And apparently after knight g6, maybe I'm still in the game, but if I were to say move the rook back to e3, after rook to c1, I simply lose the bishop, I lose the game as well, and I'm left wondering what on earth did I do? So for that reason, I spent 9 minutes playing rook e1, but even though I was able to come up with the best move here, now from a mental standpoint or psychological standpoint, I'm feeling very shaky, because for a player of my level to miss a very basic idea like f5, I almost played knight e5. Now I'm feeling very, very unsure of myself. So Pravian plays queen b2, and now I blunder with this move bishop a6. Now again, all of this, the whole sequence of the time usage combined with the blunder missing f5 plays an epic role in terms of why I did not find the best move. Now, surprisingly, after this move knight to e5 and rook to f8, white is actually very close to winning here with this, maybe not winning, I thought this was winning, with this move rook to d1 here, because after queen takes a3, I have bishop c4 hitting the rook. And if black moves the rook to, say, d6, for example, I can play this move rook to d3 here, and suddenly the rook is being activated towards g3. Say black goes queen b4, and I get rook g3 here. Suddenly I have all these ideas with queen f6, queen h6, queen g4, and black cannot defend against all the threats. But again, because of the time usage, I'm getting a little bit low on time. I very nearly just blundered the game away in one move. I'm not really feeling so sure about myself. And for that reason, I was unable to find this. Now, I do think if I had played that move rook takes e4 instantly, I have 7 more minutes, or even if I had played a3 quicker, if I have 30 to 35 minutes here, I think there's a very, very good chance that I actually would have played this move knight to e5 here and rook f8, and I would have gone rook to d1. Alas, it's not meant to be. Also, just to point out here, if black were to play a move like b5, stopping bishop c4, I can still go rook d3 with the idea of rook g3. And with this great knight on e5 and the bash and all these threats, again, computer gives white a significant advantage. But as I said, I'm not feeling great. I'm getting low on time. And the last thing I want to do is play something like knight e5, rook f8. Let's say I go h4, and somehow out of nowhere end up in some position like this, where black is just pushing the queenside pawns, pushing the p, and I just lose the game. So because of the time usage, combined with the fact that I very nearly blundered in one move to lose the game, I'm simply not able to put it together. I know that might sound repetitive, because I think I've said that 2 or 3 times already, but just want to reiterate why the mindset or the mentality really matters so much in chess. So I ended up playing bishop h6, which is a blunder, and the reason this is actually such a severe mistake is because black's only move is to play g5, hitting the queen. If black moves the rook to almost anywhere on the c file, he loses. Let's say he goes c2, I check, and I win the rook on c2. If he goes to c6, I have bishop b7, winning one of the rooks. And if he plays this move rook to c3 here, now I can go knight to e5, hitting the pawn on f7, and after f6 here, now I simply go queen g4, hitting the pawn on e6, and black's position completely falls apart. But the problem is, since he can't move the rook on the c file, if he were to say go rook d8, now any idea of trading off the rooks is gone. And after, say, bishop to b7 here, let's say rook d7, for example, bishop c6. If rook d6, I can simply go bishop to e8, hitting the pawn on f7. If he plays rook a7, for example, I can simply go d5, and after takes, and let's move knight to d4. Suddenly, there are all these massive threats here. Knight f5 with like mate threats with queen g4. I have pressure on the e file, and it's just a great, great position for white. So problem here is not so much that it's just a mistake, but it's a mistake because black has only one good move, and Pravian finds it immediately with g5 here, attacking the queen. And the problem is now when I go queen f6, black can play rook c1, trading off the last rook on the board that I have. And unfortunately, with the bishop and the knight, it's not enough to create a mating attack. So I trade the rooks. I go bishop f1, not king h2, by the way, because after king h2 and queen to f4, once again, this gets very, very scary with black having these 2 pawns on the queen side. Black is pushing the p, and there's a pretty decent chance that I lose the game. So I go bishop f1, Pravian takes the pawn on a3. Now I go knight e5. I've got this great queen and knight combo, but unfortunately, Pravian is able to sack the rook with rook takes e5. If he were to play this move queen f8, guarding the pawn on f7, after knight to g4, I'm actually doing very well here. If black plays h5, I go knight h6 check, king h7, and bishop to d3, and I simply win the game due to the knight and the bishop combo. Additionally, if black plays queen g7, I can go queen e7, threatening to fork with knight to f6 here. And after queen d4, knight f6, king g7 takes, queen d5, and queen b4. Maybe it's still a draw. Actually, computer says it's zeros, which is kind of surprising. But at least the show goes on. But when Pravian sacks the rook here on e5 for the knight, I take with the pawn, and he goes queen c1. I have nothing I can really do here to keep the game going, because black is just going to push p, make a second queen, and win the game. And more importantly, the bishop on f1 is pinned, so I can't bring this bishop into the game. If I could get, say, one more move even, let's just say I could get this position with like a3, for example. I guess it's still a draw, but there might be some hope with some bishop d3 and queen h6 and some bishop h7 trick just to illustrate it. Say black queens, check, 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 and mate in one. But again, in this position, I'm lacking time. I need to get the pawn up and the king up before I can bring the bishop into the game, and it simply isn't there. So I end up forcing a draw with queen d8, king g7, and now I go queen f6 back. If I were to take the pawn on b6 here, on first glance, after a3 and queen a6, it looks like I guard the bishop, and I'm stopping the pawn here. If black plays queen b2, for example, I have bishop to c4, cutting off the a2 pawn push. But here, black is actually winning after queen to a1. Because now if I go g3 and a2, I'm not in time to play bishop c4 due to the pin. If I move my king, queen b2, a1, second queen, gg, why not? And additionally here, after queen to a1, you might think, well, wait, go king h2. Queen guards the bishop. And on a2, bishop c4, right, to win the pawn on a2 with the queen and the bishop combo. But unfortunately, black can take this pawn with check. And after I block, black again gets a second queen and wins the game. So there's simply nothing left to do. And I end up having to resign myself to making a draw with the repetition here. And the game ends peacefully. So somewhat disappointing result from the standpoint of me having the white pieces against a lower rated player. But as I've said, Pravian, very strong player. Most of the game I think was pretty good, but the critical time usage on those 3 to 4 moves in the middle game, combined with overlooking a one move tactic, really doomed me in terms of chances of winning this game. I think as soon as you miss a one move tactic, like say you see it, but then you play a different move, already in your mind, you're a little bit shaky because you're like, wait a second, I missed this basic tactic. I have to recheck every variation multiple times. The confidence is gone, and you're just always seeing the boogeyman after that. So it ends in a draw. It is what it is. That means that I now have the same score as Magnus Carlsen with 4.5 points out of 6. I think we are both half a point out of the lead. So still many more games to go. We have 3 more games in this tournament. Not ideal, but we'll see what the future days bring. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of Magnus' game as well as my game. Make sure to smash that subscribe button below if you haven't already, and I'll be back tomorrow with a recap after round number 7 of the Qatar